I'm a 24-year-old female that has spent the majority of my life outdoors camping and hiking through the wild terrain. I've also been studying zoology and biology for the last 6 years, and have been in close proximity to bobcats mid-hunt, protective mama bears, and territorial elk. I'm disclosing this because all of these experiences have been quite scary, but I have never been more terrified than I was the night I encountered an unknown entity in northern Arizona. In March of 2018, I decided to go on a back road drive with a friend of mine at around 2 a.m. The area is well known for the almost zero light pollution, which makes the night sky mesmerizing on a clear night, which that night was. The area I was driving in was a thick pine forest, and I was on high alert because of large elk in the region. After about an hour, my friend and I made it to a paved road, leading back towards home. The road was a T-shape, and we were stopped at a stop sign, taking a moment to update our playlist. I'm about to shift out of park, when I look about 30 feet in front of me. I'm facing the pine tree line that my headlights are illuminating. The tree line sat along a small 5-foot ridge that was parallel to the road I was turning onto. I noticed a door-sized block of my view that appeared to be warped. It looked like I was underwater and looking up at the surface. The image was just distorted and constantly shifting within the frame. Very odd. I sat there for a while before I told my friend that I thought I was hallucinating. To clarify, I wasn't under the influence of any substance and hadn't been for almost a year. I was concerned and was about to suggest they drive instead since my vision seemed to be impaired. That is, until they told me I wasn't hallucinating. They were witnessing the same thing. Without looking away from the block, we both described the exact same image, so at this point I'm a bit freaked out. We're pretty logical people and didn't want to jump to any conclusions. There must be a rational answer. So of course we do what sane people do on a dark back road. We put my car in park and get out of the vehicle. I know, not smart. We kept my headlights on as we crossed the road heading towards the distorted block, and noticed that as we moved, the portal wasn't moving from its original spot. So that ruled out any kind of fumes possibly interfering. As I reached the ridge that the portal sat on top of, my friend stopped. He said that it didn't feel right and that he thought that we should go back to the car. He's smarter than me. At that point, I was more intrigued than scared, and I was already 10 feet within the thing, so I might as well finish the job. I started walking up the 5-foot incline when I was filled with the most intense dread I have ever experienced. I could almost reach out and touch the warped doorway when my foot softly planted itself directly in front of it. At that exact moment, the most horrendous noise erupted. It sounded almost as if someone had dropped a metal tank out of the air. It was the loudest metallic crash I have ever heard. I was so startled by the noise that I lost my footing and slipped down the ridge and caught my footing right as I was next to my friend. We both looked at each other in scared confusion when the night air filled with what sounded like 36 coyotes calling. I'll admit, it's a pretty common thing for coyotes to call out in groups. They're kind of known for it. But what's unusual about this specific situation was that the 36 coyote howls sounded like they were screeching in our ears. It was so loud that we had to cover our ears as we ran to my car. I felt like I was about to be attacked by all of them, and they were about to jump on me by how close their screams were. As I was running back across the street, I was looking around desperately for the coyotes to determine how many there were, but not a single one was in sight. As soon as we slammed and locked the doors of my car, the noise that was almost debilitating the moment before went completely silent. Nothing. Not a single peep. I looked up as I was shifting into drive, and I saw the warped portal was now gone. I confirmed with my friend that he no longer saw it too, and drove the hell out of there. We got home in record time and ran inside my home and discussed what happened until the sun came up. We both encountered the same phenomenon out there on the road. We both saw the warped apparition and heard the same noises, We were both filled with a nauseating dread and were hysterical in what we had experienced. We couldn't solve it logically and were desperate for answers, so the next day we started speaking to some friends who grew up on the local Navajo reservation. When we shared the experience, they were all convinced that we had encountered a skinwalker. When I first heard the term, I was sure they were kidding, but they truly believe in this. They grew up with the warnings from their elders, so the fear they have for this thing is real. Some would even walk with blessed ash on their forehead to discourage skinwalker encounters, a sort of protection charm. I was told that a skinwalker's scream is similar to a crashing metal, and that the coyote noises was the skinwalker trying to disorient us. So I looked into other skinwalker encounters, and it's a real inconsistent mess of stories out there, but I have come across a few that are similar to my own experience. The main issue I have with this explanation is that I never saw a humanoid, just a transparent doorway. This starts when I was around 13 years old. It's worth mentioning that I didn't have a very good home life, but I also wasn't very aware of this fact. I suspected that maybe families were sometimes just like that. Houses were always messy and decrepit, and parents were always either insanely controlling and accusatory, or they just weren't around at all. At this point in my life, I would have to take the bus to school. I would wake up very early to catch it, and it was almost always still dark outside when I walked to the bus stop. In the corner of my eye, there he would be, in my yard. The tall, gangly figure. He was maybe 7 feet tall, papery white skin, long arms, spindly and long fingers. Humanoid-shaped body that was very, very thin and bony, and he had no face to speak of. He gave me a very deep sense of dread whenever I caught a glimpse of him, but oddly enough, he would just stand at the end of the yard. When I would try to look at him, he'd vanish. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. As time went on, he would appear in different places. When we moved, he would be at our new houses. I figured I brought him there. Sometimes at night, when everyone was asleep and the house was dark, I could swear I see him, standing in the middle of the room or sitting on the couch. I avoided passing the living room at night altogether because of him. I was terrified of his presence. When I realized he probably wasn't going anywhere, I decided I should name him. I had an issue with personalizing things growing up. I would give objects names and personalities. This prevented me from wanting to throw them away, and I still sometimes struggle with this. But in this instance, naming him was what I was using to be less scared of him. I named him the Pale Man. As my mental health declined and the emotional abuse I was facing became more apparent and rampant, he became more bold, it seemed. Sometimes when I would be in the shower, I would swear I could see him on the other side of the curtain. I would see it slowly move, as if he were poking at it. I would press my back against the wall of the shower and watch him slowly scratch at the curtain. He never tried to open it. He never made noises. I could just see his familiar tall shadow from behind the curtain. He did scare me, but I felt confident telling myself he wasn't dangerous. One of the houses he had followed us to had a long, poorly lit hallway, so any time of the day, if my door was open, I would see him walk past, quietly and quickly in the dark. It almost became comforting to have him there. My mother was rarely home, and my brothers didn't seem to notice him. It's like he was there to check up on me. I started to whisper into the dark living room at night, "Good night, Pale Man." And I would see him slowly wave from the couch. Fast forward to now. I live with my girlfriend. I started seeing a therapist. Though I haven't mentioned Pale Man, when I started taking medication and addressing issues and old trauma, he started to show up less and less. The last I saw of him, he was in the living room, standing. He was too tall for the room, so his head was bent a little forward. I waved at him. He waved back at me. I said to him, "Good night, Pale Man. Thank you." He bowed his head a bit. I walked to my bed. He stayed there. In the morning, as always, he wasn't there. But then the following nights, he also hadn't shown. I was a bit sad to have him leave, but I'm sure it's for the better. I like to think he moved on to better things. I know I sure did. I have direct memories of only one abduction event, but I'm pretty sure I underwent routine abductions until the age of 6 or 7. As a very young child in the 1980s, I used to be taken by the Easter Bunny to the North Pole to play with Santa every year on Christmas Eve. I was sworn to secrecy about this, or else the Easter Bunny said he wouldn't come back. These visits happened every year without fail. At the North Pole, we would play together in a 2-dimensional space, and the games we would play were educational in nature but very fun. The experience was more like a projection or video game, but I would experience it as real. It's hard to describe. I have no recollection of the specifics outside of brief memories from my last visit. What I do know is that I loved these trips, so much so that before my last trip, at the age of 6 or 7, I was actually more excited for the Easter Bunny to come and take me than I was for Christmas the next day. On this trip, I was told I was getting too old for these visits, and this would be the last one. I was profoundly sad. For a couple years after the last Easter Bunny visit, all was quiet. Then, when I was 9 years old, the first and only abduction I can clearly recall occurred. I do not recall the initiating events. By the time I had came to, I was already being led into my front yard. It was lit up like day. I say, being led, but I cannot remember if I was alone or had some sort of escort. I want to say there were entities to either side of me. My childhood front yard was basically a jungle, but there was one patch of grass that opened into the sky. On more than one occasion, I had sleepwalked here as a child and awoken on this patch of grass in the middle of the night. In the center of the patch of the grass was a tiny silver craft, what I would describe as a typical flying saucer, only extremely small. The craft was so squat that I probably couldn't even stand up inside of it as a 9-year-old child. I would estimate it was 5 feet tall and 12.5 feet across, and it hovered about 4 feet off the ground. I do not recall if there was any sort of landing gear or if it was freely floating. In front of the craft, walking toward it, and perpendicular to myself, was the classic gray alien. It did not acknowledge me. The creature was childlike in stature, probably a foot shorter than me at 9 years old. I, having only seen my first drawing of a gray a few months before this event on a television program, should have been terrified, because after viewing that program, they immediately became fixtures of my nightmares. Despite that, being confronted by one in real life for the first time, I felt perfectly calm and serene. There was some sort of opening into the craft, but I cannot recall if it was a hatch or a gangway. I was escorted toward the opening, and I remember as I passed the outside of the hull, there being Egyptian-looking hieroglyphics inscribed along the lip of the craft. I black out. I am seated on a bench in front of a glass screen. Across from me is a gray. Our attention is devoted to one another, and we are interfacing through the glass screen device. I am in what I take to be the interior of the craft, but the room is far, far physically larger than it would be possible based on the exterior of the saucer. There are other beings in the room who are engaging in other tasks beside what me and my partner are doing. My attention is wholly devoted to the screen and the task at hand. The screen is a clear glass screen set on a table approximately 4 feet in height, and there is some manner of console on my side that I am using to interface with it. I do not recall the gray having anything to use to interface with the device. The task I'm devoted to had something to do with communicating between English and the alien language. A thought suddenly comes to me. Why am I using this device to translate between English and the alien language when we can just talk using our minds? I find this thought very funny. I'm having fun. Though the precise nature of what is going on eludes me, What I believe I'm doing is typing in English and having it translated to the alien on the other side. This doesn't make much sense, though, because I understand these beings to be able to communicate telepathically. As I use the device, the Grey is also using it at times, whether to teach, correct, communicate with me, I cannot recall. I black out again. The final stage of my abduction is a series of movies projected directly into my mind. I only recall 2 of them. In the first, I'm in an inlet, in a sea, in a sort of land before time. The earth is primordial and pristine. I am moving through the water towards the mouth of the bay, and along the coast on either side is luscious, undespoiled jungle. It is profoundly beautiful. The second is a snippet of apocalyptic environmental imagery. I see a breakwater or a coastline with a lighthouse situated on it. Waves are surging over the sides and consuming the coast. I am made to understand that humanity is responsible for what's happening here. The abduction ends. When I awoke the next day, I didn't feel scared or terrified, but a sense of calm and inner peace. My mind, however, felt totally overloaded, like way too much had been put in there to ever remember. I was startled by the fact that I hadn't been afraid of the Greys, because I'd been having constant nightmares about them. I was far more concerned, fixated even, upon remembering the message I had been given. This message, which seemed all-consumingly important, began to slip through my fingers as soon as I had woken. It was only through sheer will that I was able to retain the 2 snippets I can recall here today. For many years, I myself chalked these memories up to sleep disorders or being the fantasies of a child. I left them in the past. Then, a few years ago, I stumbled across a claimed abductee named Jim Sparks, and the parallels to my own experiences were insanely uncanny. Instead of talking about medical experimentation or sperm extraction or other common abductee claims, he talked about how the aliens would place him in front of a glass screen to learn how to translate the alien alphabet. He talked about a mass abduction event that would have occurred when I was 9 years old, in which the abductees were all gathered around and shown images of Earth's oceans undespoiled, prior to human damage and then the deleterious effects of human industry and pollution upon the world. I will not vouch for the veracity of anything else he discusses, because he does make some very outlandish claims. I'm very hesitant of anyone claiming to know the nature or purpose of whatever this insane phenomenon is. I cannot deny, though, at least for my own abduction experience, he was right on the money. What he describes is precisely what happened to me.